Bonjour mes amis. Rest of intro in French deleted. Welcome back. It's 10ish, Redmond time, which means we're starting on time, ish. And you can tell we're building up to the point where we change version numbers because more things are popping up as red. And a lot of things that are not red still for the same version. I feel like it was only like a month or two ago that we actually ran out of 8.0 issues. Fun times. Okay, first up, treat memory and read-only memory of T as a T array in system text JSON 86442. I assume that's going to be Mr. Sarpalis.
Yep, I can take that. So if you could just click on that link at the top of the issue, that should contain the actual proposal. So this is basically an API proposal to add built-in support for memory and read-only memory types in system text JSON. And obviously for that to work in the source generator, we need to expose a few APIs. Now, the first thing to note is that there are two factory methods for that are generic and are there for the general purpose read-only memory and read-only memory serialization, treating the values as JSON arrays. But because, as is the case with byte arrays, we want for consistency to treat memory of byte and read-only memory of byte as base 64 encodings, i.e. as JSON strings, and hence the two different sets of APIs.
I'm just seeing what types are what things are currently exposed on JSON metadata services.
It's a whole bunch of things, but I would recommend looking at the array APIs, which
Click, I drag, thank you. I drag.
so there's byte array converter, which obviously handles the base 64 encoding for byte arrays. And then we have the one method called
create array info.
Create array info. So essentially, it's extending pretty much the same convention for memory and read-only memory, respectively.
Yeah, so it doesn't look like there are any generics in here already. Unless you count array as generic, in which case it was byte array, and here it's proposed as memory byte instead of byte memory, but byte memory feels weird. So yeah, all seems fine to me.
These are going to be turned on by default, I assume, right? Like if you see the appropriate data type as a property, you just automatically trigger these.
Correct.
Yeah, seems.
Options, collection info. Yeah, seems. Just like everything else in this type.
And I guess I guess I've stated this before, but just to reiterate, JSON metadata services are not editor browsable, and they're only meant for invocation by the source generated code.
Meaning the whole type itself is ebnever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it still shows up on what I will forever call MSDN.
When you're deserializing, I assume you're just by default instantiating the new array each time and then just wrapping a memory of T around it.
I would presume that's what the implementation is going to look like. So it will create a new array and wrap it around a memory or read-only memory.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Add system text JSON support for more numeric types. You're still up.
Yeah, so the two actually go hand in hand. This is for extending support for a few numeric types that come with the framework. So int 128, uint 128, and system.half. And again, the motivation here that there was a request for supporting read-only memory of half. So like they're two separate pieces of the same puzzle, I guess.
Has there been a consideration for having a general purpose converter? So public static JSON converter, binary integer converter of T, basically. And then having a method get binary integer converter of T that just operates over iNumber and uses the APIs on it, or operates over ibinary integer and uses the APIs on it to get the underlying raw bytes, which are in a fixed 2's complement representation.
No.
This is still supports net standard 2.0 though.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right, but we can multi-target, right? And we do multi-target, right? Because half, for example, is not in net standard 2.0, nor is it 128 or uint 128.
But it's still in net 6.0 and I believe net 5.0.
Right, but net 5.0 is out of support.
Yeah, correct.
And net 6.0 is going out of support soon.
Yeah. To answer your
and
question,
I think int 128 is net 7 only as well.
To answer your question, though, we haven't actually utilized any of the static abstracts that exist in the core library, and the same is true for numerics. If we are considering it only for the case of perhaps using it internally in some of the converter implementations to avoid some duplication, but this is basically just following existing convention with how numeric types are handled. So as in providing separate converter implementations for each one.
Yeah, and I think that's good for the effectively primitives. I was more asking, has there been consideration of adding a general purpose binary integer and binary floating point converter? That way users can support any of their types efficiently without having to, expose the entire world. We only have to worry about built-in helpers for the core types, and then there's a general purpose helper for everything else.
No, that hasn't been considered yet. I think one consideration here is that the way that numbers are serialized in system text JSON are customizable via the JSON number handling enum, and it might be that this is a red herring, but I haven't necessarily considered how that would compose with some of these interfaces. But it's definitely something to explore in the future.
Of the new numeric types, I don't see inint and nuint. Should those just be added at the same time here?
I think for inint, we just throw as unsupported. Is there a use case for marshalling these?
Yeah, we talked about this previously, I think, and the idea was like, why would you want your payload to maybe not even deserialize correctly on the target? Like, just use long and call it a day.
Right, there's places where it is appropriate, and there's lots of APIs in interop code and other places that do serialization of native integers in throughout the entire ecosystem, but they're all incredibly error prone, and you really want to always be doing them as 64-bit. That way you never lose data.
I mean, for such specialized cases, and assuming that they would want to use JSON in that scenario, I think we could just recommend users to write their own JSON converter, assuming they understand the implications of what they're doing.
Okay. I'm just eliminating or asking if we can eliminate a future issue, but it sounds like we're hoping that there won't ever be said future issue. Because in the issue you would say what you're doing is nonsense, do this other thing instead.
Well, I've actually done before, like what Tanner was talking about, where you have to pass values across machines, and those values are handles basically. And what I ended up doing in production was the same thing that Win32 does under the covers, which is like everything just gets normalized along everything, because it's just, like Tanner said, way too error prone otherwise.
If you're speaking Win32, presumably you mean long.
Sure. Well, C# long Win32 keyword, yeah.
Yeah.
So these proposed APIs are only available on certain TFMs, right?
Correct.
Like half will be there for 6.0 and above, and the top 2 will be there for 7.0 and above.
Yeah, let me double check the supported TFMs that will be available with the upcoming release. But I believe that it's 6.0, 7.0, and 8.0.
Yep, and standard 2.0 and NetFX, whatever
Yeah.
the 4.6 of the day is.
Yeah, so these wouldn't be available in Net Standard 2.0. There is prior art in that. Last year we shipped date only and time only, so it is the case that we are basically exposing APIs only for specific Neo frameworks.
Alright. Anything else on this one? Sold.
Thank you.
Decouple validate on start from hosting 84347. I have no idea who this is.
I can cover this. So the feature is basically to move the existing implementation of eager validation for DI options from the hosting assembly to the options assembly to support hosts outside of the default host. So since it's in a separate assembly, we need some mechanism to for the host to ask for the list of validators to validate. So this interface was primarily intended for host consumption of the mechanism to trigger the validation in the options assembly. So this is basically just almost like an internal host implementation of, hey, give me a way to call the validators when starting up. There has been some discussion offline about whether this interface is the best approach or not, but ignoring design decisions for the moment. I mean, this is the minimum API that we would need, just a simple validate method.
Yeah, so currently this is done like internally with a hosted service, right? And kind of part of the objection is like, if you're going to use the validate on start extension method or whatever, like you need hosting for it to work anyway. So why all this work to remove the hosting dependency? Because if you use options without hosting, these just don't get validated, right? At least not on start, I guess, when they get resolved, right? But the point here is it's supposed to be on start, but there is no start. But like, there's no plans for anything else to call this interface, right?
Right.
But I guess
it'll be documented to say, hey, if you're a host, you call get service on this interface, and then you can validate. But it's not intended for general consumption.
I don't think it's bad. I do think that, like, potentially, if you're using options without a host and you don't care about the startup logic, this allows you to bring in less dependencies and feels like a little bit cleaner. Eric's in the call, right? Like, I know he brought up offline the similarities to the hosting pipeline stages.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about the reasoning, right, is because it's like libraries that don't want to depend on hosting at all, right? Like, that's why we're doing this work.
Yeah, I guess what's the point though? Like, if you need hosting to use the library anyway, but like maybe you just don't care about the validate on start if you're not using hosting, I guess would be the argument.
This is where you have a different kind of host, right? I mean, I think if you click on the original link, there's Azure Functions and I think one other scenario that they have a different host, but they still want to use the existing extension method to add eager validation.
See, I missed that. That makes a lot of sense to me then. This does seem like the simplest way to achieve that goal.
Yeah, just for completion, my questioning was, like, this seems really coupled to options and validation, where it's really just, I want to execute some code during the startup. And so kind of two things. Could we make it more general? And then the second thing is, can there be a collection of these things? Here's a collection of things to run at startup.
So like, you're saying that services that basically want to be like pseudo-hosted services might just start implement this and do like non-validating things and validate, use it as another like startup stage.
Another part of the pipeline, exactly. That was my point. Like,
yeah.
I think that that's if we just had the simple the single interface, and we didn't have the option to add those other things in the future, then that makes sense. But I think until we have those requirements, and people might want different kind of hooks, just like we have almost a dozen hooks right now on the current host for timing. That I think it's kind of premature for that. I mean, this is validation, what we want in a specific spot in the pipeline. So if somebody starts using this for things other than validation, it's not considered. It's not the intent of this interface, and it's not considered a supported scenario right now. We should probably do that properly and think through that.
I mean, there's two different scenarios, right? One is option validation, and the other one is singleton warm up, whatever you want to call that, like getting your singleton services and pre-warming them.
And like, fundamentally, we have to explain to people like how the iApplication lifetime cancellation tokens versus the iHost lifetime, or whatever you called it, methods versus now this, like when they run, and then we can never change it.
Yeah, I mean, my questioning was like, should this be more general, right? Because it would solve both of those problems.
So we like move the hosting lifetime stuff like out of hosting. Like, would that still be a goal? Like,
I don't think the hosting lifetime. It's just an interface that's like, I'm an initializer. Here's my initialize method. Call me when you want to initialize. And then make these a collection, and people can register their initializers without depending on hosting.
If we multi-purpose this and we allow multiple subscribers, then we encounter ordering issues.
Then the other question is, does this have to be public?
Well, it's currently not, right? But it does if you want third parties to be able to participate. But like right now, well, without using hosting, right? Because third parties could run iHosted services right now, right? An internal iHosted service is what's doing this. Validate on start logic.
Well, the reason why it's public is because they're in two different assemblies, right? I mean, you have to call a method on an object that lives in another assembly.
Right, but like today, right, the validate on start extension method like doesn't have to live in hosting because it adds a public iHosted. Well, the service descriptor uses a public service type iHosted service, and then there's like an internal thing that
Right.
does the
Basically,
validate.
this is just making that internal thing public, and and then adding an interface on top of it.
Yeah, like making the contract for it public.
I mean, I'm not going to object if we think that we only need to solve this one narrow case. Like, but it seems like this is a really narrow solution to a more general problem.
And we will be looking at the singleton warm-up feature that you mentioned for this release. So I guess one thing is that we could come around if it makes sense to extend this when we do that, or to use it for both. But at this point, I think those are two different time periods. So I think we'd want to have two different ways to do that.
Okay.
This is-
I've raised my concern. So if we think those are resolved, then like I'm not going to object.
So, one observation that I have is your interface is called validate on start, and the method is validate. So, basically, you're putting in the interface name the notion of when you intend to call it, and that just feels weird.
Yeah,
Like you're describing caller behavior, not what the type does, not what the group of members is related for. It's just like this is when you're going to call it, and that feels bizarre.
It's essentially mapping to the extension method, which is called validate on start. But I mean, if we had an iValidate, with the validate method, I mean that would work too. But let's say you haven't, you want to validate on end or something like that, or stop or something like that. You would need two different interfaces at that point, or one interface with two methods. But we can call it validate on start. I mean, the actual method instead of validate. That would work for me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's a thing that I don't know that I'm suggesting anything. It just feels weird to me that the name of the interface is describing when it will be called.
It's a service, right? So it's attempted to describe an operation.
Because if we go with the notion that interfaces should be adjectives, / adjective phrases instead of nouns or noun phrases, then this is really kind of, because you're self-describing, it's really like I startup validatable. But
the thing that you call this on contains all of the validators, not just one. So the way that it works is you call this extension method many times, validate on start, and it basically adds to a dictionary. Or you can consider it a list or whatever, but you know, as many validators. So it'd have to be some sort of plural version of that. I mean, not validatable. I think that describes an action of many operations. I mean, of one operation that affects many validators and not. Anyway, I'm open for naming. Nothing comes to mind.
I don't know, as everything in Microsoft extensions, especially that uses interfaces, rankles me. I recuse myself from further discussion.
Yeah, from naming generally, iStartup validatable would be preferred, but if this is consistent with other stuff in extensions, then so be it.
Well, I mean, it did sound like what he was saying is this isn't a thing that is itself the thing that's validatable. It's a thing doing validation, which
right.
So it's like I start up validator,
right,
which is a thing that was suggested in chat by somebody who understood the ordering more than I did.
Oh yeah, I see that now.
That makes sense too. So I start a validator. Is that what the recommendation in chat was?
Yep.
That makes sense.
And then this validate method kicks off other validations somewhere.
The host ends up getting an object that implements this interface and calls it.
Is this only ever meant to be used by the host itself?
Yes.
This interface?
Yes.
Do you have a namespace that is just like host interfaces that people shouldn't look at?
I don't think so. I mean, I can look here if there's a better namespace for it, but the extension method is actually in a kind of a weird namespace, in my opinion. But that's the way it is. It's in the dependency injection namespace for a reason at the time was to avoid adding an extra using statement, from what I've been told.
Yeah, in extensions, you always match the namespace to the target. Like in, extensions assemblies, that's just the pattern. It's like 95% consistent. So if you have like an iService collection extension method, it's in dependency injection.
There is a hosting.internal namespace.
Oh, the legacy of pubternal. Remember that?
I mean, isn't that what this is basically?
We've
Because
done
you
away with
literally don't
pubternal.
expect anyone to use this.
First of all, I'm sure Jeremy will talk about naming guidelines and things like that internal. But secondly, like we actually used to do that, and again, I would say when in Rome, but we mostly deleted all of them except for like the handful of things that people actually used. But we tried to do away with all of them.
This interface is also going into the options assembly, which is like a lower level, if you will, than hosting. So it'd be
I'm
weird.
s- I'm surprised you're not just like shoving an action in a dictionary somewhere with like a GUID key. And
Oh,
saying,
in.
like, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, pubternal is verboten, but if this was going into a assembly and namespace that already had an internal namespace and this belonged with all of the things in it, then that would be a win in Rome. Especially in case that flabbergast Stefan that I would say that. But
Yeah, the only reason I suggested that is because like I'm just trying to figure out if we can, have it not show up in IntelliSense without slamming EBNever on it.
I mean, it is kind of a half good point. Like there are other things in this namespace that kind of sound like this that you are supposed to implement. Like there's an I validate options, which is an interface we expect people to implement. If that's sitting right next to I startup validator, yeah, I don't know. Maybe EBNever is a thought here.
I'm not a big fan of EBNever. Like, people will still see it sometimes. Like,
This isn't the type of thing we come to EBNever.
it will show up in the
What-
Sims collection and so forth.
Why do you say that, Levi? What are the types of things we EBNever? Like we
Normally-
just JSON metadata services, which we're like
Normally it's compiler magic stuff that we EBNever. And this isn't really compiler magic. Like if you look at the things that we EBNever, it tends to be things to support new C# language syntax or things to support source generators. I mean, there are exceptions, but that's like the big bucket. Anyway, if it confuses
least-
people, we can always
at least calls out a comment. We'll put a comment in the docs saying we don't expect you to implement this.
Yeah.
fair enough. All right. So no EBNever.
If only we were more comfortable putting interfaces as nested classes underneath static extension methods.
Our rule for nested types is if users don't have to use them, it's fine. So if this is basically intended as a system-only thing, if burying it in some other type actually made sense instead of just burying it, then that'd be fine. Unless the runtime forbids nested, or sorry, unless C# or the runtime forbids nested interfaces. I don't actually remember, because it's almost never a good idea. But interfaces themselves are almost never a good idea.
Well, the logical place, if we wanted to do that, was the extensions class that's mentioned, options builder extensions, which is a static class. But again, that's just an extension. I think that's the only mechanism to do this right now. I mean, to add the eager validation.
Like maybe we're just overthinking it, like as what's on screen. And if it confuses people, we can always retcon EBNever on it. But once we get the evidence, it confuses people.
All right, so leaving it as it is, or moving it to nested inside options builder extensions if that's legal. I don't have an opinion. I just need to know what to approve on.
I would hit go on what you have on screen right now.
Okay.
Send it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Wasm SIMD API changes 88092. I'm guessing Tanner.
Yeah. But technically it's Radic, but I think he's oof, so it's gonna be me. The basic premise here is that we approved we previously reviewed and approved some of the system runtime intrinsics WebAssembly packed SIMD APIs, and there's a few changes that are needed after going through the actual implementation. So in particular, convert to int 32 saturate the return. The uint type should have been named convert to uint 32 saturate, just to avoid the conflict. Convert narrowing saturate needs to differentiate whether it's a signed or unsigned saturation. So it should match what we've done with ARM64, which is suffix the signed or unsigned word, to differentiate between the two.
Then just making sure these are saturate and not saturated. There are two verbs in this.
Yep.
Okay.
That's the convention we went with for ARM. There's also some API. The final bit is there's within SIMD both the terms scalar and lane. Sometimes those terms are interchangeable. Sometimes they are not. We quite some time ago, back in like .NET Core 3.1, actually I think it might have even been 2.1 when we were first doing the design, made the determination to use the term scalar everywhere, where we are referring to a single element. And so we should fix up the names in the packed. We should fix up the API names in the packed SIMD class that use the term lane to mean scalar to use the term scalar. That is then consistent with what we do elsewhere, including ARM64 and Xarc, where they also have both the term lane and scalar.
These all seem fine to me.
Yeah, and in particular, just to comment a little bit more on lane versus scalar, lane is typically used to indicate the width that is operated on, and scalar actually means just one element. And so in the case of extract lane, it's operating on a scalar, and so lane and scalar are interchangeable there. But there's other functions like extract vector 128, for example, where the lane becomes a full vector. Or in the case of things like on x86, where you've got vector 256, you have two 128-bit lanes, and within those you have multiple scalar lanes. So it can get very confusing on the terminology, and that's why we decided to just normalize on one back then.
I have a quick question on the convert with saturation APIs. Is it the pattern that we've established that if you can tell from the data types that it's going to be an unsigned saturation because you have unsigned in, unsigned out, that we don't put the unsigned suffix? We only do it when it's ambiguous.
We've typically used the suffix everywhere where it's required. So if one overload requires it, we've typically made sure that all overloads have some kind of disambiguator to ensure that we don't end up with some future versioning problem or future name conflict problem. There's, of course, hindsight is 2020, so there's been a couple places we've missed, but for the most part, we've caught everything and made sure that the appropriate suffixes exist.
Sure. So concretely, in that second block within the proposal, the before has 6 APIs and the after has 4 APIs, because it looks like the unsigned in, unsigned out were not reflected in the proposed change. Did you want to rename things like the convert, narrowing, saturate that takes a U short vector as well, or leave that as is?
No, that in particular is the comment just above that, removing the ones that take 64-bit vector, or that take long and ulong as the element type, because they don't actually exist in the finalized WebAssembly proposal or
okay, got it.
specification.
So okay, so it was removing long and ulong because they don't exist, and removing U short and uint because there is no unsigned representation.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I missed that second part then. Okay, cool. And when they're introduced, it sounds like you would want to use the suffix anyway, just for consistency.
Right. We don't want to risk the case of exposing convert, narrowing, saturate, and then having convert, narrowing, saturate unsigned, and then you have to infer the first one is signed.
Okay. Makes sense.
Actually, just noting, for ARM64, because I was just double checking that, it's actually convert, narrowing, signed, saturate, not saturate, signed.
I don't see that. It's
Oh
not
wait,
an API.
I'm looking at PackSMD. Just ignore me. Ignore me. I thought I was looking at one class. I was looking at the other one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm looking at a yeah, I'm looking at the ARM APIs. Right, we use saturate instead of saturating saturated. And the descriptor comes after saturate, it looks like.
Yeah.
Multiply
There's a lot
doublings.
of there's a lot of ARM APIs. I actually did a count of them. There's 2,000 for just the advanced SIMD class plus the couple other tiny classes that ARM has. There's 2,100 APIs we expose for all of x86. So that's SSE through SSE42, AVX, AVX2, FMA, and all the AVX 512 classes. We've got 2,000 APIs.
Excellent.
So ARM provides a lot of functionality, and it's very consistent across the board. When they support one type, they generally support all the types.
There are some great method names in there.
Doesn't sound very risky to me.
Cool.
Reduced instruction set. We have twice as many instructions as everyone else. Okay.
Well, it's because it's combinatoric.
Yeah. I guess it's true. Probably a lot of them are same instruction with different flags. But all right. I think we're good on this one. And this means that Emo's agenda predictor was off by over 100%. Emo, you have gotten too cynical. Amazingly.
I mean, I kept doing 5. We never finished 5, so...
Alright, let's see what we can get through
the other red issues.
without pre-summons. Support error codes
Yeah.
for HTTP request exception 76644. Can anyone
We
talk
can
about this?
argue on this for I'm taking this, so we can argue on this for an hour to make the agenda filled, like we do typically with the issues I bring here somehow. We received several requests that users want to do some kind of runtime logic based on like very specific errors that may occur in our HTTP stack. Currently, the only way to distinguish these cases is to grab the exception message. So we have some customers who actually map these exception messages to their own error codes to meet their own needs. So we decided to consider some sort of solution to have error codes reported from the HTTP stack. HTTP web request used to have something, web exception status. So this is particularly interesting also for people who are migrating from that. And what users can do based on this, they can do some runtime logic, for example, do retries, or what we also seen doing that they can take a code and basically do something very similar to telemetry or metrics, basically logging a code. It's easier or better than to log an entire string if you want to do it in a performant or a more manageable way. So I did a review of all our error cases in Sockets HTTP handler and kind of distinguished these cases. We would need to expose it on HTTP request exception, and also we would need special exception type for the cases which may be thrown when you are reading the response stream, because you can ask HTTP client to not buffer the response but do it on your own. So we also need an HTTP IO exception, sort of, so we can expose these error codes. What's not nice about this, that the compatibility story is not really great here. So I would say this is very kind of specific to Sockets HTTP handler. Other handlers won't be able to implement these kind of errors one by one or do a one-to-one mapping. I would even say some mobile platforms would be only able to implement a very small subset of these. So, and we can't do anything about this. So this is, in this form, it would be kind of specific to Sockets HTTP handler. WinHTTP could, in theory, implement many of the cases, but it's still not a one-to-one mapping. I would call out this in the docs. And also I would mention that some cases distinguished in this enum are kind of more generic categories, even though some other cases may fall into these categories. So, and despite that, they are disjoint error categories, but if a platform is not able to implement some specific error, they can still implement more generic code or category. So that would be the recommendation. More or less that's it. So any questions or concerns.
So why not just add another one more overload and put HTTP request error at the end?
I don't understand you. So what do you mean?
You've added it first, and I was going to bring up the same thing.
Okay. So sorry, you mean the constructor? Yes. So there are two options. Either we expose 3 constructors, or we expose that one on the bottom, which uses default arguments. I just don't know what is the preferred.
Well, the question is why in your new constructors have you added this as the first parameter instead of the last parameter? We don't generally insert parameters in overloads. We only append them.
Yeah. So I pasted in chat the longest existing constructor, which is string exception status code. Like, you could just add another constructor that matches that but has request error code at the end.
Sure, I'm fine with that. We can have one constructor, that would be okay.
And I guess make the property nullable to match the fact that status code is nullable.
Yes.
I mean, would it be a nullable enum, or would it just be undefined if it wasn't given one?
Undefined, yes. So there is a default error case.
Well, so like HTTP status code defaults to null instead of 0 if there was a problem, unless someone explicitly passes it in as a constructor parameter. I'm wondering if this should do the same, default to null instead of 0.
Actually, in the first version of this proposal, I wanted to make this nullable and not have an undefined case, and got some feedback from Steven that this kind of error codes enums should have a default case, a non or undefined case, instead of making it nullable.
Well, 0 and null are different. Like, null means it wasn't specified, and 0 means it was specified, it's just it didn't cleanly fit into any other value.
I see. It's interesting because we could have a generic error case, but also we can have an unspecified case. So if it's the recommendation, I think it would make sense to have to make it nullable, the properties. So I'm happy with that, actually.
Writing it down.
Are there cases where this exception type HTTP request exception is ever used for the request went through but the server returned an error? Because presumably if there was an HTTP status code response, then the request did go through.
Yes, this is completely different from status codes. So when the request goes through and there is a status code there, these error cases won't occur. Only the status not success was included because there are some overloads on HTTP client which can throw. So we decided to distinguish an error code or error case for that.
Okay. So does that imply that if the status code is set, but the request error is not set, and the status code is anything other than 100 or 200 range, that you would infer status not success?
Yeah, in that case, I think we don't need status not success, probably. So for me, it feels a bit redundant. I'm happy excluding that, actually, especially that we change it to nullable.
So for a invalid, so if you get back a 400, that will have request error is null and status code is not null.
Yeah, in that case, yes.
Okay, just making sure you weren't going to say undefined and
Yeah, I'm
not
thinking
null.
if I will regret it.
I mean, as long as there's consistency here in with what people expect to happen, right? Like what I'm wondering about is, are people intending to use this request error property to learn anything at all about why the request or response failed, aside from the fact that like there's an actual exception? Or does the request error code literally mean like I couldn't even send the request to the server, something happened on the transmission end?
Basically, it means that they didn't get a meaningful response. So it could be a connection error, or error during establishing a connection, or error during sending the response.
Okay. So something happened such that I didn't even read an HTTP response payload from the server.
Exactly.
Okay. As opposed to HTTP status code, which is I read a response and it happened to be 400 or about.
Yes.
Okay. Right, so we've gotten 2 comments about HTTP IO exception in chat so far. The first one is the constructor was named wrong, so I've just fixed that. The other is here in your comment you say response, your alternative name is HTTP response, and then you have a thing called a request error. So why are you mixing request and response?
Because we have an HTTP request exception, basically. So HTTP request exception means that you got some error with the HTTP request, and we also have this request error in HTTP request exception. But I agree that this is confusing if we would name this IO exception an HTTP response read exception. So maybe HTTP IO exception is definitely better.
Well, I mean, I think the question is there a thing we can rename the enum to that would make more sense, or do you think that yes, you're trying to read the response, but the request failed, so
yeah, but
what it's really saying is there is no response.
Yes, and it can happen as early as DNS resolution, so it won't, for me, it doesn't make sense to talk about the response at that phase at all. So I would personally stick with HTTP request error because it maps to HTTP request exception nicely, easier to discover.
That seems fine.
Okay, and now, so we had the nullability of HTTP request exception. Is the nullability correct in the IO exception? Like it's a required parameter, and you'll infer a message either generically or based on that error code?
Yeah, if we make this nullable, HTTP request error nullable as a property, then we can make that exception nullable, or the constructor also nullable. So if we make the properties nullable, we should make them nullable in both exception types, and then we should make them nullable in the constructors.
Well, so we have HTTP protocol exception today has a constructor that I just posted in chat that mandates passing an error code, and the error code is an int64. What would you do if I passed in an HTTP request error instead of a long error code? Like, what does the error code property turn
Sorry, I didn't hear your last.
So, a HTTP. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. I'm looking at protocol exception. Sorry.
I mean, it's supposed to derive from the IO exception, so
Yes.
I think the question's still valid. Unless you see that you were simply just mixing two paradigms.
Sorry, HTTP protocol exception doesn't need new constructors because it's always mapped to a specific HTTP request error. That one, yes.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I was looking at the wrong type. Sorry. So we're looking at HTTP IO exception.
Yeah. Right. So in HTTP request exception, part of why we had nullable here, maybe it wasn't the only thing in the end, but part of why we had it was that there were providers that just won't understand how to build these.
Yes.
So does the same nullability apply in HTTP IO exception, or does the IO exception...
It's the same.
Okay. So that one should be nullable too.
Well, but this is a brand new type that we're talking about.
Right, yeah, that's why I was, I guess, questioning if it was the same, because...
Oh, but HTTP protocol exception is going to be overlaid on top of it.
But HTTP protocol exception is going to call base passing HTTP protocol error, so it already has... The callers don't need to pass in an error code into protocol exception. So this is still provider. The provider who only knows about this is agnostic to this new property. Anyone intentionally throwing one of these is in the future where this request error already exists. So I don't know that there's a case where you would say you don't know the error unless you're going to find anywhere that's an IO exception currently and make it an HTTP IO exception, but presumably you'd still know what state you were failing in.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. So we can, but then the API will be a bit asymmetric, although there is a reason. So,
I mean,
I'm wondering how do we feel about it?
Well, I think they're asymmetric because they're different. Like,
yeah. Actually, I agree. So
yeah, what's confusing me is what I posted in chat is the current constructor of the HTTP protocol exception type. The current constructor takes a mandatory long error code that if this exception type is changed to sit on top of HTTP IO exception, then somehow we need to coerce a long error code into an HTTP request error enum.
Why?
And if it's not nullable.
But
sorry.
My understanding is this guy will call base always with HTTP protocol error. 100% of the time. All error codes map to there was an error in the protocol, that's why it threw a protocol exception.
Okay.
And then now you would, presumably there's a property on this type that gives you back that long, and now you get to go see what basically the value here of HTTP protocol error is go look for the other error code.
Okay, got it.
I think.
Yeah, that's how it is. It's a different error code, kind of specific to HTTP2 and HTTP3.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so chat points out this type uses an exception parameter named inner, and this one's inner exception. I think inner exception is the correct name, and this one was wrong, but it's already wrong, so we're going to match what it already says.
Well, IO result calls it inner exception, and because this subclass, sorry, IO exception uses inner exception, and because this subclass is IO exception and passes it through, I would say we should just maintain the name.
Right. I think inner exception is the correct name. I think HTTP request exception got it wrong, and the new constructor on HTTP request exception should look like the other constructors on HTTP request exception and continue naming the thing incorrectly.
Yeah.
Because ultimately they all come from exception, which I believe calls it inner exception, which means that is the one and true name of that parameter. Okay, so we got through that. So now we're down into the enum members, I think. Personally, I feel like, especially since your comment here is DNS request failed, that this is name resolution failure instead of error, but error's fine.
Yeah, but we call all of them with the error suffix.
Yeah.
Well,
that's fine. I think error like kind of reads better than failure.
Yeah. It may have simply been that this saying failed was like, well, then why doesn't this say failed? But unsupported.
Just don't repeat the same words.
Yeah, unsupported extended connect reads. It feels like it's missing a word.
Case.
Either it's extended connect not supported, or like unsupported extended connect option, or like this just it feels like the name is not balanced.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy with extended connect not supported.
Okay. So the thing that it's reporting is an extended connect was specified, and that itself was rejected.
Exactly.
Okay.
Do we plan on adding new enum values in the future?
No. That would be a breaking change. Actually, if there are new error cases, then it's possible. If we want to divide more general cases into more specific ones, that would be a breaking change. So kind of yes and no.
Generally speaking, adding enum values is in this manner is not a breaking change. The reason I bring it up is because like if we did plan on adding them, like should we cluster them?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
You don't. If you want to add later, you definitely don't cluster, because at some point you're going to screw up your clustering, and like the only time it makes sense to build ranges and partitions within your data set is when you say it can never ever ever be changed, because otherwise at some point you'll regret that, like, 100 through 199 and then 905 are this one kind of error group. I mean, if we wanted to do weird things with a bit that indicated, I think retrying this might work, or a bit of like, yeah, I totally had to close down the entire connection because of this error, but now we're getting very weird.
Yep.
But yeah, no, clustering bad.
Fair enough.
Extended connect not supported. Proxy tunnel. All right. So were you removing now status not success?
Yeah, I would remove that given given the nullability.
Response.
The other thing I want to caution about is having errors that are too granular. I see invalid response and invalid response header, for instance. This implies that if you see that the incoming response doesn't match the HTTP protocol, you're going to try parsing it anyway as much as you can and report back exactly where you think the failure is. Generally, making that type of guarantee to callers is a recipe for disaster, because it means that we explicitly have to go against spec in order to try to figure out what the failure was, rather than just reporting a general, like, this was a protocol error thing. Like, this is something that WebSockets does, and I absolutely hate it.
I don't know that it gives that suggestion. Like, so sticking with HTTP 1.1, which is the last version I understood, like if the response doesn't start with a 3-digit number, that would be invalid response. But if you've made it past the response code and you're now in the middle of the headers and you haven't made it to the body yet, then that would be, hey, the server started replying HTTP and then it got all gibberishy.
So you're assuming that the reader is a state machine that starts status line headers body, which I agree is the normal way to do it, but we're now basically saying all readers must do that.
No, I was like, so this one is, I was processing headers when I failed. So, I mean, I can agree that maybe nobody needs to know the distinction, so they should be collapsed, but this one just says when the error occurred, we were processing headers, and this one says we were processing the response, not necessarily a header, because we didn't know we were processing headers at the time. Whether that means it's too early or too late, we weren't processing headers.
Yeah.
But the server responded, like, this is server responded with gibberish, and this is server responded with some gibberish that maybe you should go debug. But yeah, I will agree with what I said of questioning, does the caller need the distinction?
For what it's worth, in HTTP 2 and 3, like the status is just like a special header. And that's how you start the response. It's just like header sequences.
But presumably you can't start. I'll just assert that you can't start with the 0 byte. And
yeah, I'm sure.
And then that would be like, well, I moved into parsing the response, and it didn't look like a response. So
yeah, at least in Kestrel, like, you know, you can have invalid frames. Like, we wouldn't even know which response to associate that to. At that point, we would just like kill all of the ongoing streams for a protocol violation with the same error. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because the socket's dead at that point, basically. You can't sensibly understand it anymore.
Yeah. So again, the question is it worth exposing the difference to people?
Yeah, it was a debate also in the team. So, and on the other hand, like one case that this customer mentioned that they would actually like to know or see to know, and the case where they use it, and actually we could use it also. They were doing something similar to metrics, so basically logging this as a numeric value, and we could also use it in our metrics, because otherwise I don't see what can we log as an error, like the exception message, and then which exception in the chain of inner exceptions. And with this we could log a code that users could go and debug if it appears more often in their stats. So that would be.
Does that mean that if we ever end up in a situation where people expect it to be an invalid response header, but we report invalid response, that we would treat that as a breaking change because customers would complain?
Yeah, exactly. This is what I'm saying, that removing these codes or changing anything around this would be a breaking change. I would say the way it is handled now in Sockets HTTP handler is a way that is unlikely to change. So if we can report invalid response header when we encounter an invalid response header, we can do it in the future also. So,
But
I
if, for example, WinHTTP gives some of these codes back and it just says response is invalid and doesn't make a distinction between response and response header, then now you're back to caring about what provider returned this code.
Exactly. This is why I started the discussion that the compatibility story around this is very bad. So we cannot do one-to-one mapping even to WinHTTP. And if we are talking about mobile handlers, it's even worse.
Right. But again, the question comes down to, aside from logging that it was an invalid response of an unspecified invalid response versus an invalid response header, why does someone care? And if the only reason is they're logging it, sure, then make the message different, but they're both the same error code. They're both the response was not valid.
Yeah, that's the only thing.
Yeah.
Since it was, this is the thing that most people question about it. So we can exclude all. If this is a concern, we can exclude all the 4 cases at the bottom, because those are getting even weirder.
Well, response ended. That one makes sense, and presumably other providers may give, like, that's unexpected term. Like, I was receiving the body, and presumably this is I had a content length, and the connection closed before I received that many bytes, and then you're like, it server disappeared. I don't know, and that's, connection terminated seems like a fine thing to be different than the response was gibberish. So I can see there being a thing here, and maybe what you find is you keep getting response ended after a gigabyte. And like, oh, okay, my big things are all failing. That's a thing that's different than, like, I don't think you're talking to a server, or I don't think you're speaking to someone who speaks HTTP. Like, that's a very different world.
Yeah. So those last two, what I would recommend for those last two is collapse all of those into a generalized some limit has been exceeded error code, and then have the message tell you what limit was exceeded. Because right now you're special casing the content buffer size and the response header size, but you could imagine that maybe Sockets HTTP handler in the future has some other limit, like a timeout, or the maximum number of headers, period, as opposed to the length of each header, and so on. Like, presumably you don't want to add a new error enum code every single time Sockets HTTP handler gets a new limit. So you could collapse them all and then use the message to tell you what changed, or what got violated.
Yeah, in that case, I think it would be very hard to define a name for something that also wants to include future cases. So we can also just collapse it into invalid response.
I mean, invalid. Well, you could say the response was valid, but our configuration told us not to treat it as success. So you could say something like literally configurable limit exceeded.
I would say configuration limit exceeded.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that clearly tells you, like, this is something that you're able to change at the call site.
Yep. Yeah. Makes sense.
And then, like Jeremy said, for debugging and logging purposes, the message text itself would say exactly what happened. And if you care, you can go, trawl your logs and figure it out.
Mm.
Right,
because it's not that nice, because we have like a chain of exceptions, and
sure,
the
but
one that really tells you it's
the only the main reason that the enum should make a distinction is if somebody in their catch is going to look at the code and react to it, and they're probably not going to look at the code content buffer size exceeded and then go increase the content buffer size limit and try again. At which point it's now down to exception text, and that's the general rule for exceptions in the platform is unless someone's going to write a handler that reads your enum code, don't give them an enum code. I can see unsupported extended connect, somebody writing a handler that's like, oh, there's an option somewhere that I need to not do. Maybe.
That's exactly the reason why we included it. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you can programmatically recover.
Right. And similarly, the content buffer size exceeded, like, sorry, the configuration limit exceeded. That's, hey, this went wrong because of a choice we made. We might increment a rate counter that says, like, we have a limit too low, and like, but that's as far as I could see somebody reacting.
Yeah, but like presumably you wouldn't do that in response to seeing one of these. Presumably you set that limit for a reason before you made the request.
Right. But looking at your logs and seeing what was going on is like, oh, we may have just chosen to. We may have chosen a bad number.
But you're not going to a human that's going to make that decision.
Right. You're not going to be like, set it to 200 bytes, and oh, I got this error. Double it, and like.
Yeah.
Then why didn't you just set it to unbounded?
Why even? Yeah. Like why bother? Maybe it's because you're using this as a glorified trace route. Maybe that's why you bound it. And see how far you can get before it fails.
All right. So forgot some backticks.
First line should read HTTP request exception. But so, do you think that this gives Etten like enough granularity and enough information for somebody to be able to debug these in practice with the changes that are being suggested here?
I think yes. So they can react to some cases. They don't want like as high granularity as WinHTTP has, for example. We have just a few customers who are engaged, so the information is kind of limited. We have to guess, but
yeah,
that's my best guess at the moment. And one thing, since we did we change it to nullable? Yes, we did. Then I think the undefined could be probably unknown error or something like that, because I used the word undefined to cover also the cases when the handler wasn't able to implement it.
Yeah, unknown error would also work there.
Yeah, so that would be better, in my opinion.
Okay, you can rename it undefined to unknown.
Yeah, and I while I was looking at your sample code, I think you're right, Anton, that adding any enum values here would technically be a breaking change, because if we expect people to special case the values, then adding a new one and then like redirecting existing cases there would break them. It would be the equivalent of throwing an exception where previously one was never thrown.
Well, I mean, I think anything that's throwing or anything that's producing something with unknown, or you're getting the exception with, null, so no HTTP status code and no HTTP request error. I think making errors to talk about those cases is fine. and then there are probably even some things that you can jiggle around and say, you know what, the notion of connection versus transport versus the TLS handshake going wrong, like, those are loosey-goosey, and if our implementation over time loses the ability to make a distinction, do you really care?
Well, so the answer is yes, because if you look at the sample code that's actually in this issue, those 3 error codes that you just called out are very clearly special cases, transient errors that they expect people to retry on.
Well, but that means you don't care about the distinction across them. You care that
but if you care that your retry logic is still being hit.
Right, but if everybody treats the handshake error, the transport error, and the connection error as the same, I should just try again error, then if these errors move into this bucket, nobody really cares.
Well, so that raises the next question of, like, is this still too granular? Are we giving people more information? Are we giving people so much information that they're going to make mistakes while trying to interpret?
Yeah, and I guess the thing you're saying is if they took secure connection error and then split it into itself into 2 codes, that the new code is going to bypass somebody else's, I should retry. But
right,
I mean, honestly, so what?
Yeah, like make the code change in the application, redeploy, call it a day.
Yeah, like,
yeah,
you didn't think proxy tunnel errors were retryable because you didn't think you had proxies, and then one day a proxy appeared, and like now your retry logic is wrong. Like, it happens. Retry is really just an optimization of do something before moving to persistent failure, and if you learn, hey, there's a new code that I should have caught as retryable, then change it and move on. It's not going to cause you to, launch missiles when you shouldn't have. Probably. .NET is not allowed to be used in defense systems. It says so in the EULA.
Yes.
All right. Are we good here?
Yeah, I'm okay with the shape.
All right. Want to double check the current request exception and make sure we're not introducing ambiguity. So none of the current constructors use defaults. If you specify just string, you'll get this one. And if you, in order to use the new constructor, which was over here, if you want the default string, you'll have to say null, comma, still. But I think that's probably fine, because I don't think there was ever a suggestion that you should be able to provide a request without providing the message. Sorry, an error without the message. Yeah, the shortest had both of them, so I think we're correct here.
What happens if only a message is provided? Won't be it embedges between this new constructor and the one that only takes a message? Sorry, maybe this is what you talked about and I just didn't understand how it will be resolved.
If you only specify a message or one parameter, if you've only specified one parameter, an exact match on signature, which will be this one, wins over anything with defaults.
Okay.
So it will call this constructor. It's only when when it can't find a valid target that then it starts looking at defaults. Boom. Hey, it's everyone's favorite GitHub bug. HTTP client factory logging configuration 77312.
I think we need a Natalia for this, and she didn't assume that it will be. It wasn't on the agenda posted in the email.
Okay.
We were too pessimistic.
How about configure sockets HTTP handler for HTTP client factory with iConfiguration 84075?
Also Natalia.
Okay. Guessing that's the same thing. All right. Collection literals. I think Steve said we'd probably want to rope in Cyrus. Yeah. That we'd probably want Cyrus and Chuck, and we didn't give them a heads up, so we'll skip that one too, and I will now accept nominations.
Ooh. Append all bytes seems easy enough. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just kidding. I was gonna say a joke. Let's do real things.
Oh, but it's not marked for 8.0. It's the first one that's not 8.0.
Who cares?
It just seems easy enough.
The append all bytes?
Yeah.
Especially if you already have append all text.
Yep.
I'm assuming that append, or that write all bytes called it data. I called it bytes. Alright, do we care about bytes versus data here?
This will be the first read-only span, read-only memory API on this class, I believe. Everything else just takes straight-up arrays.
Okay, I mean, do we want to say that we want to overload write all bytes to take read-only span at the same time?
I'm regretting having us look at this right now. Because I can easily yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tanner.
I was just gonna say it feels like this is one of those types where like the concept of the APIs there look good, but like we probably want to go through the entire class and expose span APIs for everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. If he proposed this with byte array, would we take it?
Yeah. Yes, in a heartbeat. Because it matches append all text, it matches write all bytes. So, yeah.
Are we going to approve it as byte array for consistency? Is that what you're writing?
Yep.
And I agree with Tanner. I think there is value in doing a pass release, if the whole class all up can or should be span. But that's like, that should be done as a separate pass, probably not as one decision.
Yeah, I think there's I think IO in general has been neglected for span support and system console as well.
I was going to ask that. So if you have file IO, like you can't really use spans without converting to byte arrays currently.
Right, because there's most of the overloads don't even take an int index or int offset int length. So you like have to create a concrete array most of the time today.
Though, I mean, is file stream optimized? Because I mean, stream has the span stuff, right? Like that would be fine, right? But it's like less convenient.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure file stream doesn't do the span when rinse an array copies into it and calls the array when. I'm pretty sure that one changed to being span based in its implementation.
I hope.
It is like the streamiest of streams, so I think we got it right there. All right, so write all bytes calls it bytes. Should we call it bytes here too for consistency?
Yeah, just match the argument names. I'm regretting looking at this a little less now. Sorry.
And then write all bytes does have the async. Yep. Okay. All right, got 15 minutes left.
We could look at 85911.
85 rescue.
So the language is looking at adding, and one of the language team members is actually actively working on adding ref read only. Where the difference between ref read only and in is that ref read only requires the value to have a location, and it's actually tracked in metadata as a by ref with the requires location attribute. So that means you cannot, for example, pass in a literal value. It is adding this in a source compatible way, provided that the underlying method is not virtual. We, within the BCL, have a number of APIs we've exposed that we have a couple that are taking in that really need to be used with something that's coming from the location for typically because passing in something like a literal is nonsensical or a misoptimization. And then we've got some older APIs which were exposed before in existed as a concept, and so they're just taking ref, which means that you have to use weird tricks if you're passing in a value that is, for example, coming from a static ref read only, or a static read only or read only local, etc. So the proposal, since the language is adding this support and is adding it in a source and binary compatible fashion, with there just being with the note that there is a warning issued in a couple edge cases, that we update our APIs to explicitly take in the quote unquote proper variant. So nullable and read-only span are both currently taking in. They should be turning ref read-only.
So, in what I consider to have been a terrible design decision in the language, in can be passed implicitly. Is ref read-only also implicit?
Yeah. So that's one of the edge cases where ref read. So to be source compatible, ref read only is allowed to be implicit, but it warns, and so users will have to turn off the warning. And that the only reason that warning is there, or the only reason it's not required, is so you can go from in to ref read only and make that source change.
Okay,
Yeah,
so,
so this forces it to be an L value instead of an R value, right? That's the big change.
Right.
Okay.
And so users who are passing in a value implicitly here, so something that didn't have a location, will get a warning when they recompile their code after we take this change.
so if they do it implicitly or using, I think you could also have specified keyword in on your parameter.
Right.
Those will
Keyword
in will still work.
Keyword in still works. Implicit will warn.
Okay.
Yeah, that seems correct.
And from, I'm just curious for our design guidelines going forward. I also know that the book is going to be screwed by this because it talks about in and ref read only interchangeably. But that's future problem. Is ref read only going to fix the problems with in? Like, we don't use in because in is hard to do correctly. Is ref read only easier to do correctly?
Right. We don't use it because of the implicit semantic, because it allowed an R value to be passed in. So you could do something like R say. So if we had exposed R same using in, then you would have been able to pass in R same 5, 6, just using the literals 5 and 6, and that's problematic because that 5 is implicitly captured in a local, and then a byref to that local is passed. Ref read only does not allow, without a warning, you to do that, and so you will get a warning. You will see I'm doing something likely wrong, and you will be encouraged to fix it.
Right. Well, in has the, if you have an in but you call a member not marked as read only, it makes a defensive copy and then does it anyway. I assume ref read only is going to say you can't call members not marked as read only.
That's a thing for the implementation. That makes no difference to the public API service.
Okay, well, I mean, but part of the, like, you've chosen to say in for performance reasons, but it's probably going to actually screw you in performance because you're going to get it wrong. Is part of why FDG says don't put in public API.
That's just a question for the implementer, though. That's a
Fair enough.
That's a thing that the implementer can get wrong, and it has nothing to do with the consumer of the API. I don't know if and I actually don't believe, but I'm not positive that ref read only functions the same, and so you can still call an instance member and get a hidden copy in your implementation. But that's just a implementation thing.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, I think that implementation detail will affect whether or not we think it's appropriate to use in certain kinds of API, but
Yeah.
we'll see where that goes when it gets there.
So
Why would this one change to use in?
For this one in particular, it's changing to in because in C and C++, the actual signature of this is GUID ampersand, which is an implicit byref, rather than GUID star, which would be an explicit pointer. This API was exposed back in .NET 1.0, where only ref existed, and because you couldn't use the ref keyword for in parameter in C# 7.3 when in was introduced, we couldn't make the change to allow the better thing. Now with the new feature, you can use the ref keyword for in, and it will implicitly convert the mutable ref to the read-only ref, just like it works for other types of references. And so this better matches the native signature and allows R values to be passed in where many people might do new GUID something because they're trying to quote a literal GUID. Or, for example, type of t.uuid or .guid, whichever one it is.
Fair enough. Well, because yeah, the thing we wrote in the guidelines is you're not smart enough to use in correctly. I mean, that's essentially what it's saying. But we said in should never appear in public API. So if we think that these are correct and in is actually the right answer, then okay.
Yeah, I think this is the case where the guidance is the guidance was mostly correct for the point in time it was written. Now that we have the new thing, the guidance should likely be updated to clarify the differences between ref in and ref read only, when they are appropriate to use, and the guidance under which they should be used. But the general guidance is still most APIs should not be using ref read only or in, or because that's a special consideration for like high perf scenarios and stuff. It's not a normal API consideration.
Yeah, I do actually like this from the perspective of it matches very closely the existing native query interface API, because it takes a const ref to a GUID, and in is our representation of const ref.
So are they?
And the same goes for the.
Are they changing the language that you can use keyword ref when calling an in? Because I thought in current versions that's not allowed. I don't think.
Right, that's not allowed, which is why you couldn't. It's not allowed today, which is why you couldn't migrate an existing ref API exposed in like C# 1.0 into an in API. Part of the new feature is they are allowing the migration between ref to in and ref to ref read only, and from in to ref read only. That way users can actually ensure that their APIs, regardless of whether they were created 20 years ago or 5 years ago, or 1 year from now, can do and expose the right version of itself.
Okay, so this is not a source breaking change then, because of that compatibility you just mentioned. Okay.
Yeah, and the write API and memory marshal is a similar consideration where it was an API exposed before we had in. It was taking ref for performance reasons, for the consideration of large structs, and so it took a ref t. The actual API doesn't care whether the value it's getting is an R value or an L value. It doesn't matter if it's a true by ref or just something to a local spilled on the stack.
Are any of these? Sorry, thought you were done.
And so in allows it to work correctly, regardless of whether you have an R value or an L value. So it allows users to just do the slightly more efficient thing, or slightly more easy to read thing.
Are any of these types exposed via NuGet, as opposed to being in the shared runtime?
Unsafe
You mean do we ship
was?
Or?
So there's a variant of this question, which I'll ask, is do we say that the new concurrently newest version of the compiler is always required for moving to a new version of .NET NA Core? Because we're saying all these things are not source breaking, but it's only not source breaking if you have the vNext compiler. So if any of these things are shipped in NuGet, you won't necessarily have updated your compiler, but you're going to get a package from the future, and now it's going to say, hey, you can't pass this GUID as ref because the type doesn't say ref.
Yeah, so we stopped shipping unsafe, I think, 2 years ago. It's permanently locked at like version 6 or whatever now, unless that changed.
Right.
Is that right, Tanner? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
None of these ship in down level OOBs anymore. And from the perspective of .NET Core, the only officially supported compiler is the one that ships with VS or the one that ships with the .NET SDK. Changing your compiler, such as by using a compiler tool set, is considered unsupported.
Okay. So it is not a thing that we care about of you have the in-market compiler against the vNext runtime.
Right.
Or against the vNext ref set.
Yeah.
Right, and that's specifically considered unsupported because the vNext reference set is typically using the latest language features in some APIs.
Yeah, but usually that'll only mean that you'll hit a member or type that you can't talk about, not that it will reject loading the whole ref set. I think. I could be wrong.
Yeah, the same would be true here. You'd hit a member that wouldn't be usable.
But in this case,
it
wouldn't be that because you were trying to call a new member. This is because you're now trying to call an existing member, and it tells you you're calling it in a way that no longer makes sense. But that if you had the next version of the compiler, then it would make sense. So that's yeah.
Right, but that's also the key about it being a source compatible change, is you can keep using refs. So even if you're multi-targeting and you're cross-targeting .NET Framework and .NET 8 simultaneously, you would just continue using ref and you would suppress any warning that may appear, and say, don't suppress this warning once we drop .NET Framework support.
Yeah. So YouTube has a question about multi-targeting, specifically mentioning system threading volatile, because this exists in .NET Framework and .NET Core. I assume ref read-only, the correct keyword is ref. Right, because you said it'll do implicit but warn that you should put the keyword on it. And so I assume that the correct keyword is ref. And so the same syntax would work both for Framework and Core Current and Core Next. Yes, both, all three.
Right, so the actual speclet, which is...
Right, so
it might not be the most up-to-date version of the speclet, but it's here. It actually has a table that describes, here's the call site annotation, here's the type of parameter you're allowed to pass to it, and whether it gives a warning, an error, or is simply allowed. And so the table all makes sense in a source-compatible fashion.
Okay, so I think it sounds to me like every ref to ref read only is just goodness.
Yeah. Well, assuming that the
provided that
is not modifying it.
Yeah, provided that the API in question is never going to modify it. So you wouldn't want to do it on something where you might modify it in the future, but for something like volatile read, which it's never going to mutate the location, it's general goodness.
Right. Sorry, I mean. That anything that we think that it's correct that the read only be applied, there's no risk at all in doing so. .NET Framework callers calling the framework version will be fine. People that are similarly multi-targeting across various core versions, they'll be fine. Anyone who is calling the version already, it says ref. The keyword they use in the new version is also ref, and there's no warning involved. So ref to ref read only, when that's the correct answer, is 100% goodness. The ones that are weird are in to ref read only and ref to in.
Right, because if the parameter is a ref, you can only use ref. If the parameter is ref read only, you are allowed to use ref or in. Having no annotation is a warning. If you have in, then ref is allowed, but it's a warning. In is allowed, and no annotation is allowed. And if you have an out parameter, then only out is allowed.
Right.
And I linked to it in chat if you want to open it and see the table.
There's a window around here. This window? This window. then I know I have something in the book in the breaking changes section about ref to in or in to ref, and I'm seeing if I have a note in here that still feels valid or if it's just about the syntax.
Yeah, in particular, ref to in used to be breaking, source breaking, and now it won't be source breaking provided it's not a virtual method.
Ref, outer in, none of those are part of the signatures. So no missing method. But it might do nonsense, and it might do compile breaks. Okay. So is there, right, so if you took a thing that said out, I'm going with the extreme case. You took a thing that said out and you changed it to in or ref. A thing that used to never read, and the language would allow an uninitialized state to be present if you set the uninitialized, or don't init my locals. If the runtime changes the out to in or ref, or ref read only, it's now allowed to read the garbage, which is bad. So we would still say out shouldn't change to anything else. Is there...
Yeah, out is always breaking.
Is there any similar nonsense is about to happen if someone has compiled with any of these, or with ref or in, and we change it to ref read only, or are all of these all going to be fair? No, and no nonsense data is going to make it through as a result of changing these.
So changing from out to anything.
Yeah, that one's nonsense.
Or anything to out is breaking. And changing from in or ref read only to ref is breaking. Source breaking, and could potentially cause hidden mutations.
Right, because now the compiler happily passed a ref to a thing that was marked read only, and the runtime doesn't respect that read only and will now write through the ref.
Right. Yeah. But changing from ref to ref read only or in is safe. Only resulting in an error, in a warning if you're converting from ref to in. And then converting between ref read only and in is technically safe, just resulting in a warning in differing cases, whether it's an L value or an R value.
Okay. Because I know.
Typically, you shouldn't be changing that though.
Right. Well, because I read through the thing, and basically what I wrote in the breaking changes there is, as far as the runtime is concerned, all four of these just say ampersand.
Right.
And so they're all, you can't overload across these because they all have the same signature. And then it has the notes of like, but changing the semantics on here can allow garbage, like if out changes to ref or in, now you might be reading uninitialized stack. And
right.
So I'm just asking the subtle extra question of, are we allowing any data validation errors in here? And since all of these already had read context required, as long as we don't break the out barrier, it sounds like we're fine. And so that was just me redundantizing.
Okay. So it's a good question, but yeah, the compiler, the C# compiler is a thing enforcing that validation because, like you said, the runtime is not.
Right. Okay.
Which is fine.
So
totally
from
fine.
The big hand wave thing, assuming that we're not supposed to be doing validation of does it actually make sense to put read only here, is all of the ref to ref read onlys are safe in all contexts, and the ref to in or in to ref read only could be breaking if something's in a NuGet package, but it doesn't apply to any of the types presented here. And the reason I say in a NuGet package is because now you could be on .NET framework or on an older .NET SDK, you don't have the compiler from the future, but you're seeing a break across your call pattern.
Right, but also noting that you can have different ref assemblies per TFM, so you can still do it safely.
Right, but then we would have to go through the notes here of like, we need to split this across the TFM boundary and blah blah blah. But,
Yeah.
and
So if
But
we wanted
don't
to
have any
change,
considerations like that.
yeah. So if this API proposal here like affected system text JSON, for instance, then we would have to have a deeper conversation there. Like if system text JSON wanted to change some of their ref APIs or in APIs to ref read only, then everything we've been talking about would come into play. But the APIs that are being proposed here very specifically are not part of OOD packages anymore. They're just shared frame.
Isn't it nice when things aren't part of OOD packages?
Mm-hmm.
One of the nicest things about this is most of the unsafe APIs were exposed, prior to in existing, and so they all take ref. And so today you end up having to do a lot of unsafe.as in to a writable ref. So unsafe actually becomes slightly safer with this change, because now you no longer have to do const cast to remove the read-onlyness to make it usable.
This will make a lot of our call sites cleaner, especially with is address greater than and are same. Because what Tanner just mentioned, we do const cast all over the place to work around that. But yeah, I will be very happy once we don't have to worry about down-level platforms anymore for our OOBs. I was writing a package the other day that targeted 4.0 and net 7. So that was
4.0, not 5.
Net framework
6 or 8.
4.0.
At least, man, I remember. What was the one where you had to like add all the task helpers? Was it 3.5 or 3.0? Like before async await.
It was 3.5.
Yeah, that was fun. Everything in ASP.NET had its own copy of task helpers at least.
No, this was some stupid thing too, where it's like, I know for a fact the machine has 4.6.2 on it, that I just need to trick my ref assembly into projecting itself as 4.0. And then under the covers, I was just calling 4.6.2.
Yeah.
I was like, madness.
You can, there's like, I found a blog post at some point. If you download like the right NuGet package for like the ref pack and drop it in like the right Visual Studio folder, it does the thing.
But yeah, I don't see any problems with the API proposal here. In fact, I would suspect that we'll probably see another wave in the not too distant future of like, here's more stuff that we might want to do. But honestly, what's presented here is like the 90% case.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I think the number of people who understand L value and R value is fairly small, and that
we need to bring this to the language discussion.
that if we think that there are cases where we're going to say we think adding in is correct in the future, then we might, even if it's not something we publish in FDG, I think we need this group to have a better understanding of when we think in might be appropriate.
Right, so this is allowing an R value where it wouldn't have before, right? Changing ref to N.
Yeah. It becomes a question of, does the data need to be passed by ref? Is it going to be mutated, and therefore it could be ref read only? And then the third qualifier is, does it make sense for users to pass in literals,
right,
or expressions like new t?
Mm-hmm.
If all three of those are true, then in can be used. Otherwise, you should not use in. And so in the case of write, it makes sense to be able to write, for example, 128 UL to the span.
Right, but we also have, because part of the justification in the book of don't bother with this is the passing, like people say, oh, but passing by reference is better when the struct is big, and it's like, yeah, see the guidance that says don't have big structs, and
right, that's the other thing, and
so like for
memory marshal.
For write of T here, it's like, well, this is super generic. You could have had your own internal struct that violates the guidelines of don't have big structs, and like maybe this 100% makes sense, and so maybe it's that it mostly makes sense with generics. It's like GUID's on the fence of is it worth. I guess GUID ends up being complicated because it has too many fields and the field boundaries get weird, but because we talk about the size boundary,
Windows,
but it's the fields boundary really. And
on Windows, it's always passed by ref.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and memory marshal, of course, is a special type. It's performance oriented in interop. This is actually a place where we maybe should have had both a T value and an int value overload. So you can have the best of I'm writing a primitive versus I'm writing a large struct and I can do the right thing. But users have so many options for doing it, and we only exposed the one back then, and
Right.
there's probably not a lot of reason to change it.
Yeah. And then yeah, the one place where C# screws up people's generic understanding of L and right value is property assignments look like an L value, but they're really an R value, I think.
Unless
method
it's a
call.
ref.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. Really, they're a method call, which makes them an R value because there's not a storage address associated
What?
with the
Right.
evaluation.
Unless it's returning by ref.
Yes.
It's
Unless
an L value because the storage location is within the span. So there's an actual address there.
Yeah, because like span's indexer
Right.
returns by ref.
Right. Well, yeah. So yes, if you're not calling a property setter, if you're in fact calling a property getter that is returning the ref, and then you're just writing back through the ref, then
And that's an L value.
yes. But a get set property it meets what you think's the definition.
Complicated.
Yeah, you meet the definition of what people say is L value, which is can be on the left side of an equals. But it's like, yeah, that one's. If you look at what's really happening, it's just calling a method named set foo, and it wasn't really on the left side of an equals. But okay. All right, I think I hit post on that. I did not. But okay, so yeah, I think the thing we've talked through here is if NuGet is not involved, then if we're in a case where ref to in makes sense, or we want to move into ref read only, that's a fair change. But once NuGet's involved, we have to do a lot more thinking.
Yeah.
But ref to ref read only is always from a all in market compiler versions will handle this either with no problem or with a I don't know how to read the signature of this thing. You need to upgrade to a new compiler. I guess that's actually a question. If you have an in-market compiler and you see a thing marked ref read only, is that gonna trigger a mod rec that says nap time, or is it just gonna look like a ref?
It's just going to look like a ref.
Okay.
So that's the same way in appears today. The only time mod rec is involved is if it is in or ref read only on a virtual method. In the case it's a virtual instance method, then it gets annotated as with a mod rec, and then the down level compiler will be like, I can't do anything with this.
Okay. That just goes back to public virtual is bad. All right. I mean, it would apply to protected virtual too. But. All right. I think we're good. And because I asked a lot of questions, that turned a 15-minute thing into a 30-minute thing. But I at least believe they were good questions to ask.
Yeah, I think it helped clarify a lot of questions for people watching.
It might have even clarified things for me. At minimum, words were said, and maybe one day they'll attain clarity. I think I get it, but that may be the worst possible state. All right. So with that, thanks everyone for joining us. It looks like at least 16 people stuck through the difference between ref, read only, and in, and out. But everybody understands the difference between out. And so
we can talk about scope. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, there's no holidays next week, so we should be back to 10 a.m. on Tuesday. So we'll see you then on our same .NET time at our same .NET channel. And yes, I got those words backwards, but I don't care. Auf Wiedersehen.